This is a meeting of adult education of the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia. Susanna Dodgson will be reading from A Servant of Love in Wartime by Rufus Jones, a book about how Quakers reacted to the war and all aspects of it, World War I.
Okay, thank you, Lois. This book was published in 1920, which was 28 years before the American Friends Service Committee was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for service in World War II. But Rufus Jones was a professor of philosophy at Haverford College, and he sprang into action in 1917 when America decided to join the war effort in Europe. Now, this is interesting because the global war in Europe started on August 4th, 1914, when Germany and France and England and everyone was just running around killing each other. And America stayed out of the war until 1917, until April 1917. And the war ended in November 11th, 1918. So the Americans' involvement in the war was only 19 months. What's interesting is this whole book is just fabulous. To the memory of Isaac Sharpless. Now, Isaac Sharpless's descendant in Philadelphia won the Nobel Prize for Physics a few years ago. You know, I mean, we're a bright bunch, us Quakers. Yeah. So the book itself, it's a very thorough description of what happened when, how the Americans reacted to war. There's 17 chapters, and it goes on all about what happened. Okay, Rufus Jones was a professor at Haverford. And so he immediately started mobilizing young people in Haverford, Quakers, and bringing in Quakers from all over the country to come and do and train for non-combatant work. So they were absolutely insistent. They were not going to be shirkers. They were not cowards. They were going to do work. Feeding work, rehabilitation work, building work, and they had this huge battle with the American government to try and replace the work they were doing in France, building houses, driving ambulances, feeding people, and say that was equivalent to being in the military. So this was conscientious objection, but it wasn't accepted by the American government, and that's something that we can talk about. So before we start, does anyone? Okay, well here, this book does not profess to be a history of the work of relief and reconstruction, which Friends have done in France and Russia and in other countries since the fateful autumn of 1914. And as the work since 1917 has been a joint endeavor of English and American friends, the complete history of it must be composite, written by both the English and Americans. And when the Nobel Prize was awarded it was 1947, not 1948. 1948, no Nobel Peace Prize was awarded because Gandhi had just been assassinated. And so they decided they couldn't award it because he'd been killed, which is pretty amazing. I love this sentence. It is to be hoped that persons of leisure will be found in the not distant future who can tell with sufficient detail the interesting story of the labors of this large band of volunteers who have rebuilt homes, revived agriculture, restored the spirits of depressed refugees, saved the lives of many children, and reconstructed extensive areas of the desolated war zones, who have gone out with living faith and with efficient relief into some of the darkest regions of the suffering world, both in wartime and in the no less appalling period which has followed the armistice. Now, remember, he's writing this in 1920, and armistice was at the end of 1918. He wrote a lot of books, just in case you didn't know that. Yeah. This is the members of the Society of Friends and other Christians of similar faith who, under the compulsion of their deep-seated convictions, could not accept the methods of war, could not accept the methods of war, but they loved their country with as much devotion and fervor as any of its citizens. They did not take their unique and difficult position because they were obstructionists. They took it because they were inwardly pledged in a way of life which, if extended through the world, would eliminate the seeds of war and would bring new and higher forces into operation within the fabric of society. They could not, therefore, of a sudden change the faith of a lifetime and substitute the methods of war for the slower but not less effective forces of love and cooperation. They felt that for them to surrender their ideals of life in this crisis of history would be to prove recreant to the fundamental hopes of humanity. So this was the issue. It's interesting because I've read the reports of the outbreak of war in England, and when war was declared in 1914, there were these crowds outside the War Office in London, and they were all cheering. Yay, we're going to war. Oh, I mean, so this is what he was working against. This idea that war was noble, and for your country, you've got to go and fight. Australia lost 1 or 10% of the men. Maybe it was 1% of the men were killed in the First World War. Australians traveling to England, a massive loss of life of Australians in the First World War. My grandfather had 9 first cousins killed in the First World War, and some of them were Australian. And yeah, my grandmother's first husband was killed in the First World War. He was an artist, and then she married a Dodgson and regretted it the rest. But he was wounded too. I mean, and his brother was wounded. They survived, but yeah, it's interesting. The repercussions of war just goes on forever. And here, this was written 104 years ago, and it seems like it could almost be written today, especially with what's going on. So part of the issue, part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is, first of all, the American Friends Service Committee, which started off being an enormously helpful organization. They were feeding people, they were building houses, they were doing all kinds of things. They were counseling Quakers. They were bringing Quakers together. In 1920, the Hicksites and the Orthodox were separate, and there were other separate organizations of Quakers that basically didn't interact with each other. Can anyone talk about that? Does anyone have any special insight into that? Because I know that Arch Street Meeting was Orthodox, and even today, when the Orthodox and the Hicksites have come together, even today, meetings that used to be Orthodox, they send all their meeting notes, committee notes. They send their notes to Haverford, and the Hicksite meetings send their notes to Swarthmore. So even today, there's some sort of division. So here was Rufus Jones, knowing that there was war going on, knowing that we're Quakers, knowing that eventually Americans were going to be called up, going to have a draft. And so he was trying to be proactive, putting together an organizations of people in Haverford to to bring them together. So that's what they did. Haverford College generously offered its beautiful grounds and buildings to be used as the summer headquarters for organizing and training the group of 100 men, which for that reason came to be known as the Haverford Unit. The members of it represented all sections of the Society of Friends and also included a small number of men who were not in membership with Friends, but who shared in large the measure and principles of the Friends. There was one Mennonite in the group. And they had Wilburites is another type of Quaker that I haven't heard of. And so they were organizing all these people in Haverford, all these young men. They came for the summer and they trained them over, I think it was 6 weeks. The following on the evening of July 16th, the men composing the unit were arriving at Haverford, registering in the never-to-be-forgotten improvised office in North Barclay and being assigned to their quarters. The following general schedule of training has been adopted. 5:45 a.m., time of rising, followed by 10 minutes of physical exercise in front of Barclay. All right. 6:30 a.m., breakfast, followed by washing of dishes and room work. 7:30 to 8:25 a.m. Talks by members of the council or of the unit. 8:30 to 9:25 a.m. Talks by specialists on social services, sanitation, hygiene, conditions in France, etc. 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. And this part's the great one. Study of French. They were going to France. They had to be able to speak French. 12 noon, dinner. 2 to 5:30 p.m. Squad work in carpentry, mason work, agriculture, road making, auto repairing, and other forms of technical skill. They were really training them up to be useful. 6 p.m. supper, 7 p.m. devotional meeting, 7:30 p.m. a lecture every other night dealing with the world conditions with special reference as far as possible to France and the future work of the unit. They were not playing around. They were, this is interesting too. The day was so full that no time was available for newspaper reading. And consequently, one member of the unit was detailed to present each evening at the close of the devotional meeting a survey of the news of the day. Isn't that great? Lewis S. Gannett generally did this. Wasn't Gannett a news service? So there we are. He got some great training. It's interesting reading through this. I keep finding names that I know. It's like, oh, right, 110, 105, 4 years ago, their ancestors were active. So that's what they were doing. So they were training from July. Now, so from April to July, April was when it started, and July, then the Haverford group started, and they were trying to ship them all out by September to send them to France. British Quakers had already been there for 3 years. Going behind the destruction and rebuilding and feeding. So the British Quakers were pretty active in this. And the American Quakers were trying to get in contact with the British Quakers to interact. Now, at some stage, the American Quakers hooked up with the Red Cross, and so the Haverford unit became part of the Red Cross. So that's what was going on. Finally, they did get over there. They did get to France, but it was very complicated, mainly because of the draft. And the drafts, what's interesting is a large part of the book is just these arguments the Quakers were having with Washington, trying to get, the draft started, I guess it was sometime in 1917, and the Quakers were told that yes, you could go to France as long as you weren't drafted, but if you were drafted, you had to join the military. And there's these awful stories about what happened to people who were drafted and refused to fight and refused to put on uniforms. But that's actually something else he talks about too. Can we talk about what happened to your relative, Cindy? Can you tell us what happened to your relative? You still there? No. Yeah, it's anyway, it's a harrowing story of people who were who were not exempted from the draft. And the reason was that, first of all, that there was some law saying that if you belonged to the Brethren, the Mennonites, or the Quakers, you could be exempted. But when it really came down to it, nothing, it really wasn't an exemption at all. What Rufus Jones was trying to do was saying, okay, this group that we've trained in Haverford, they have been trained for non-combatant. They're not cowards. They want to do non-combatant duties in France. They want to rebuild France. They want to drive ambulances. They want to feed people, and they want to do all kinds of things. And it wasn't agreed to, and that was a huge setback.
Okay, I finally figured out how to get off a mute on myself. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. Well, let's talk about your relative and what happened when they they refused to fight.
Well, basically, I mean, my father was born in 1925, so he was actually in boarding school in Olney, in Ohio, and he was, I think, 11th grade or 12th. And that time during World War II, he was going to get drafted, so my grandfather just arranged for him to go in selective service. He ended up going California building trails, alternate service. My oldest brother, he was drafted during Vietnam. He went to Guilford College. He's mowing the lawns there. But what happened is my dad's sister was married to a guy from Ohio. It was his uncles that were in World War I time, and they basically got tortured for refusing to fight. And they were doing things like, mock execution. We put them in hot water, then cold water, back and forth. And I know he had told me that, one of them recovered from it mentally, the other one never did. But the law was for World War II. The Hutterian Brethren, Mennonite, and Quaker were exempt from military service.
Yeah, well, and a lot of that was because of this huge push in the First World War. I have so many stories about what happened in World War I to my relatives, and it's really pretty shocking. They were gassed. There were all kinds of awful things. So, I mean, they were having a horrible time with the enemy, and they were having a horrible time with their own people as well. Yeah.
I know my father even said even during World War II, they were, put on the train and went to California to build trails, bunch of conscientious objectors. And he said even then they were like treated horribly. People were like jeering the train, spitting on them and such. So even after the law passed, it wasn't easy.
Yeah, we had. Sorry, go ahead,
Susanna. I have a question. What did in the World War I in 1917 and 18? What did the American government do to Rufus Jones' men? What happened to them?
Well, you could either be for the ones that weren't drafted, they were fine. They just kept on. Okay.
What about the ones that were drafted?
well, they had a horrible time. That was the thing. They had to go into the military, and if they went into the military, they could either do what they were told or they could resist. And the ones that resisted had a horrible time. And that was a huge problem. So what happened was there was a first draft and then there was a second draft. So if you missed out being drafted the first time, you could go over to France and build houses and do all kinds of non-combatant work. And then the government decided that, wait a minute, if we'd have a second draft, I mean, pulling people back who are already doing useful things doesn't sound all that sharp. So they actually didn't bring people back from France after they'd already started doing the non-combatant work, which was actually pretty good. But so there was a first draft and then a second draft. Now remember, we're only talking about 19 months between the beginning of the American involvement and the end. And in the middle of that too, they also had flu, that horrible flu. So, but there are some interesting, there's some very interesting letters here from Woodrow Wilson, The Problems of the Draft. A strenuous effort was made in Washington to have the draft law include a provision of exemption for persons who had sincere, conscientious objections to military service. The men who drew up the bill were afraid that such provision would offer an easy way of escape to cowards and slackers. They were terribly upset about people who were lazy. It's like, you're a coward. And people in the First World War were being shot for being cowards when what they had was PTSD. And clearly my grandfather's brother had that after he was gassed. I found a very interesting report. When he was a teacher in Epsom, there was a loud noise and he went berserk, which is sort of what happens, when The men who drew up, they saw no way to discriminate between the sincere objector and the spurious one. So they were just terrified that you'd exempt someone who didn't deserve it, whatever that means. Someone who didn't want to fight and they didn't have a good reason. And we will decide what the good reason is. It's pretty shocking, actually. They felt a certain amount of confidence in the honesty and sincerity of the religious denominations, which had borne a long historic testimony against war and whose members had proved their faith in days past by patient suffering, voluntarily undergone in its support. The government therefore refused to go farther than to make some provision for the members of religious denominations whose fundamental principles were opposed and were known to be opposed to war. And the three denominations, as I said before, were Quakers, Mennonites, and the Brethren. It soon appeared that the provision, which had been carefully confined to members of religious denominations, did not really exempt even these persons from non-combatant military service. And the government decided what non-combatant military service was. So the government decided who was a conscientious objector and what they could do. And this was another problem too. The non-combatant military service ended up just being if you were a nurse or a doctor, essentially.
Hold on, Susanna, I did not understand can you repeat slowly what you said before? So I thought you said that the three religion, if you could demonstrate that you were a believer of those three religions, you were okay, or were they still?
Yeah, well, that's right. They said they were okay, but when it came down to it, they weren't.
Oh.
So, I mean, they lied. What can I say? That was really the issue.
But it was the same. That has not changed at all for Second World War and Vietnam, did it? That whole process.
I don't really know. People could get out of it. I mean, my mother was a physician in examining people who were drafted, and she'd ask them. She'd say, "Do you want to go to the army?" And if they said yes, she'd say, "Okay, you're all right." And if they said no, she said, "Oh, well, let's find something wrong with you." And that's,
But I mean, in
that was
terms of
pretty common.
conscientious objector.
They were. I mean, that wasn't conscientious objector. That was just getting people out. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone know?
What country, Susanna?
Well, that was in Australia. Australia had the draft until 1971. And, you know, people, my age, I was 20 then, and people were being, But Lois has a story about the draft.
Well,
I think we all have.
I have several stories. One, I had a classmate named Fred Munch who had been brought up Quaker, and he wanted to go to the junior college in town. He had registered to go there, and the military would not give him an academic exemption, and it would not give him a Quaker exemption. He wound up spending 5 years in jail.
Yeah.
And then Eric got the same A1 status for his draft. We'd already been married for a couple of years. I was 20, and I just said, all right, look, we're having a baby. That will get you out of the draft.
Yeah.
At age 20, I had a baby.
That's for Vietnam?
For Vietnam.
Yeah.
And the first story you said,
that was also for Vietnam. That was my classmate.
In jail for 5 years.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, I knew I met a veterinarian in Sweden who'd been living there and trained as a veterinarian, exactly to avoid the draft. That's exactly right. Yeah. You know, in England in the Second World War, everyone was drafted. Everyone in my family was drafted. My father ended up going to Burma and had a lovely time. He went to Burma, then he went to India, then he went to West Africa. Yes, he really enjoyed the war because, you know, it was winding down and he wasn't really in any trouble except for malaria. And, so. Anyway, here's a nice letter from the White House. I mean, Rufus Jones was working with people at a very high level. The White House, Washington, August 28, 1917. My dear Mr. Jones, I have received your letter of August 15th with regard to the work of the Reconstruction Unit for Relief and Reconstruction Work in the devastated war zones in northern France. The Secretary of War informs me that there will be no difficulty about securing the passports for members of the unit. Good sign. Unless they are of draft age and included in the first draft. So as long as you're not doing anything else, and as long as we don't want you, go to France on your own dime, do all kinds of stuff. The rule being that any man who is not called to be in the first draft may leave the country upon the understanding that he will return should his services be later required. So in other words, he also gets another chance to be drafted in the second draft, and then he has to come back. The question as to whether the work of these reconstruction units can be designated as non-combatant service for conscientious objectors cannot now be determined. The varieties of conscientious objection developed in the application of the selective conscription law have been so numerous as to make it necessary to delay the establishment of a policy until we can be sure that we have both satisfied the requirement of the law and gone just as far as we can justly go in the recognition of the rights of individual conscience in such a matter. When the total number of persons interposing conscientious objection to military service has been ascertained, I hope to be able to work out with the Secretary of War a plan which will give the nation the benefit of the service of these men without injustice to the great company of young men who are free to accept their company's call to military duty. In the meantime, I'm sure you will permit me to express my deep appreciation of the reconstruction work proposed and my happiness that it is being carried out in association with the Red Cross, which is already doing a great work in France to express the heart of America. Cordially yours, Woodrow Wilson. I might add that my father's mother was working with the Red Cross in France at this time, which is pretty cool. And that's how she met my grandfather. And actually, she met someone else, too. She met a lieutenant colonel, and he was killed. So she had a dead husband and a dead fiance before she married my grandfather. And that wasn't unusual in the First World War. I mean, the First World War was just an enormous carnage. And these sorts of letters, you're saying, well, we're not sure, we need everyone we can to go and fight. And you can't be a conscientious objector unless there aren't too many of you, so that we have plenty of people in the military. Yeah. So, but these arguments went on, and Rufus Jones just never ever stopped. He just, half of this book is is about the fights that he was having with Washington. Now, another thing that he brings up is, what is a conscientious objector? He said you had these Quakers from Iowa who were farm boys, and as far as they're concerned, a conscientious objector, they were Quakers, and you just don't do anything. You don't have anything to do with the military. And there are other Quakers who said, well, we can do non-combatant work as opposed to nothing. Now, nothing means you don't in any way want to support the war effort. Not even the Reconstruction somehow is supporting the war effort. So you don't drive ambulances to pick up wounded people. You don't do anything. So that's one extreme. And the second is the driving ambulances. And the third are people who actually joined the military. And I've known quite a few Quakers who actually chose that route. Because the idea is, though, that if you don't join the military, someone else is going to do it. Someone who doesn't have your privilege. And I know, and so you've got three things. And I know at Haddonfield Meeting with when I joined Haddonfield Meeting in 1991, there was still quite a few people from the World War II generation. And we had the whole range. We had Lyle Tatum, who was in jail for refusing to have anything to do with the war. And then we had, well, there were a couple of them who actually were in the military. And the other thing was and this is what Cindy was talking about, the work camps. Now, if you were considered a conscientious objector, if you were actually accepted as a conscientious objector in the Second World War, not in the First World War, but if you were accepted as a conscientious objector, you could go to a work camp. Now, a work camp meant you worked for nothing. You weren't paid. If you had young families, tough. So it was terribly difficult for people. And there were more people in the work camps who were Mennonites than Quakers. I guess there are more Mennonites than Quakers. I'm not sure, but there were enormous numbers of Mennonites in the work camps, and it was hard work. And they would hauling logs, doing whatever people do in work camps, but it was hard work. So, are we looking at a draft now? I don't know. Last night, seeing the British Air Force shoot down Iranian missiles, that worried me a great deal. Has Britain declared war on Iran? Are we at the beginning of something really horrible? And if we are, the first thing that will happen is young people will be drafted. And I think we need to be thinking about that. We need to be talking about that. And we need to be, figuring out ways that people can live with their conscience and follow their religion and protest. Protest any way you can. You know, my father was in the military, my grandfather was in my great-grandfather, and they were all terrible soldiers. They were really terrible soldiers. That I know. So no one was terribly good at it. Yeah. In fact, my great-grandfather left Oxford to go to join the military and become an officer and didn't like it. So he went back and became a lawyer and didn't like it. So he went to India and became a tea farmer. I think I know where my genes come from. So there we are. And then he committed suicide at 45, which I have not done. So that's good. Yeah, right.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. I guess I'm tired on Sunday night. You go so fast, Susanna. But can we roll back and see like what is really the thinking or the rationale of saying that you're talking about someone who might be who's a Quaker, you know, would rather go be drafted because of the privilege versus somebody else. Can we talk about that a little bit? I did not quite follow this.
Well, this is the thinking. You know, I'm on the board of a military museum. It's a black soldiers. These were people who generally in the Vietnam War, more people. The high school that had the most people killed was a high school in Philadelphia, with 67 of their graduates were killed in Vietnam. And these were mostly black. And every Veterans Day, they march. And the high school with the second most people killed also came from Philadelphia. So what I'm seeing, and I'm seeing this in Puerto Rico too. I mean, if you don't have a whole lot of options or a whole lot of money, you join the military.
Right,
and
right. I mean, we know that.
This has always been the case.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. This has always been the case.
But are you saying that there are some Quakers or even conscientious objectors who would go like to the army, to the draft, to go to combat to prevent someone else less privileged?
I'm thinking that is the thinking. Because I as I said, I've known some Quakers who actually did that.
And how does, as a Quaker, I mean, this is kind of very...
everyone has their own leading.
Right.
You know,
right.
if you feel that what you're doing is no one wants to be shot at. No one wants to be killed. No one wants to be in war, you know, unless you're a psycho, and there aren't too many of those. Most people don't want it, but they do it because, you know, I mean, why the 9 first cousins of my grandfather, why did they all join the military? I mean, one of them actually had moved to Canada, and he went back to England to join. And his father was a stockbroker, and his father said, you know, I'm not going to talk to you until you're an officer. And then he was killed. You know, I mean, there's just these awful stories of what was going on in the psyche of the population at the time. You know, women in England were giving men white feathers if they didn't join the military. There was like this idea that you were a huge coward if you didn't join the military. And then meanwhile, I
can speak to that, Susanna. I was a college student in the 1960s. I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I actually didn't know any other Quakers except myself at Penn in the Wharton School, where I was a pre-law major. There was a massive draft there were massive drafts. And I thought about it a long time, and I decided, and this was my thinking at the time, that my friends were getting drafted. I saw them getting drafted, or I knew people who weren't in a college that could defer their draft till they graduated. And I decided that I could not be a conscientious objector and my friends be drafted, and that I couldn't live with my personal viewpoint at that time was, if my friends or others were being drafted, I had to be subject to the draft too. And then furthermore, so I was a prime draft. Everybody was getting drafted, men. And I wanted to be a lawyer, which I ended up being. And I wanted to go right to law school, so I enrolled in ROTC to be an officer, because they would not take me for active duty until I got out of law school. And then they would take me. Then I would have to go. And that is what happened. Now, nobody volunteers for Vietnam, but massive numbers of people were being sent to Vietnam. Yeah. And I was too. Yeah. As a result, I was sent to Vietnam. Now, when I was there were 500,000 American soldiers. And that's most of them, or many of them, were drafted.
Yeah.
That was my mindset at the time. That's what I decided. And, once you live your life, you can't live it again.
Right. Yeah. Were you in Hanoi?
I was in Saigon.
Saigon. Yeah, I spent a week in Hanoi 5 years ago, and it just broke my heart. It just broke my heart. So what were we doing? What were we doing?
I was always against it, but I had decided that I would not stand aside when I saw my friends and other people being drafted.
Yeah. I've heard people say that for the Iraq War too, and the Afghanistan War. That's the thing. I mean, at some stage, you've got to decide where you are. You've got to decide what is it you can live with. I mean, you just have to figure it out. And that's going to be the case too, when there's another draft, and people are going to have all kinds of conclusions. And the government is going to do everything it can to prove that you're basically a coward. And what Rufus Jones did was he jumped the gun. He said he knew that would happen. And so before anyone could call Quakers cowards, he put together this extremely rigorous program for these young men to go to France. And I read that. They started their training in July of 1917, and by September 1917, they started going there. But meanwhile, people all over Philadelphia, Quakers. What's interesting too is he said Quakers were really coming together. They were writing to draft boards. They were working in Washington. They were doing everything they can to make sure that these young people could do that, could go to France and work with the British Quakers. And the Red Cross, and their initial goal was to build 600 houses. Now remember, in France from 1940 and on, if you've seen any of these pictures of trenches. I mean, things were just big, blown up everywhere, absolute destruction. And so the British Quakers said, okay, well, and the American Quakers, let's see if we can fix this. And the British Quakers were very, very happy to have the American Quakers there, which I found some nice quotes. And the American Quakers did a lot. They really did. They just went straight in. And here's a nice quote: "The keepers of the faith. Ever since George Fox told the commissioners of the English Commonwealth that he lived in virtue of that life and power that takes away the occasion for all war, and then, because of his refusal to fight, went into a dungeon against rogues and felons, the Society of Friends has borne its testimony to a way of life so incompatible with the methods of war that its members who clearly and positively accept the former way have found it impossible to adopt the better methods. Every time England or America has been engaged in an extensive war, the Friends in these countries have found their principles put to a searching test and have had to decide the issue within the inner chamber of their souls. The individual decisions have, of course, not been uniform." And that's what we were just talking about. Okay, well, we talked about the men doing all this training, but it wasn't just the men. I mean, meetings all over the country were knitting and sewing and putting things together. And there's some lovely stories about some shawls that were made by women and sent to France. And these widows having these shawls and being absolutely delighted that they came from American Quakers. And, the American Friends Service Committee, this is what they did. Now it seems like American Friends Service Committee is more of an advocacy organization. They write reports. I don't know that they do a whole lot of feeding anymore, but that's what they used to do. And they did all through, in between the two wars, because things didn't suddenly fix themselves in 1918 in armistice. It was horrible. And the American Friends Service Committee, and I'm not quite sure how Henry Cadbury fits into this, because this is a book by Rufus Jones, and he hardly mentions Henry Cadbury. But Henry Cadbury and Rufus Jones are supposed to be, I have always believed they were the two founders of the American Friends Service Committee, and they were some kind of relative too. Rufus Jones was born in 1863, and he died in 1948, and Henry Cadbury was born in 1883, and he died in 1964. So he was 20 years younger. But that's what they were doing. They were feeding people. And during the war, during the inter-year wars, they were feeding German children. And there's a lovely story about Henry Cadbury going to, or maybe it was Rufus Jones. Sometimes I get them mixed up. Anyway, they went to see Hitler, and they asked him if they could keep feeding children, and they were able to continue doing that. And the Quakers kept feeding people all during the Second World War. I've talked to people who were involved in putting together clothes and food packages for Germans. And my late husband, who was born in 1941 in Wiesbaden to a Jewish woman, the first thing he did when he came to a meeting in America was stand up and thank everyone for the enormous effort in the Second World War, when he was 4 years old at the end of the Second World War, and he remembered it. And the feeding kept on going too after the Second World War. And then the American Friends Committee Service Committee was given the Nobel Prize in 1947. I really hope that you can read this book, because it's very interesting, and they talk about France, and there's some nice pictures. the Children's Hospital in France. And there's a nice picture of Rufus Jones here too, who doesn't look anything like what I'd expected. He, yeah, I don't know, can't find it. Anyway, anything else that comes up from that? I'm very concerned about what's going on. And the United Nations person, the leader of, who's Anthony, whatever his name is, he's very concerned about what's going on in the Middle East with and very worried about the this incursion between Iran and Israel becoming something a lot bigger. So let's hope we can step back from the brink and it doesn't happen.
I have to go, Susanna, okay. But thank you very much. It was really informative. There was a lot of, that I didn't know.
Yeah, I think we've got to keep talking about it and keep thinking about it, and start talking to some young people, because this is going to concern them at some stage. Don't know. Thank you very much for listening.
You know, as a segue, bye, Tom.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, so we have a 14-year-old, and she just started the Young Friends pilot program.
Oh,
and
good.
Their first in-person session was 2 weeks ago, and they had a speaker. It was on the peace testimony, and so they talked a lot about the statement of conscience, and you know, each wrote, they discussed. So they heard from a Vietnam vet who, now I kind of forgot what was the story. He regrets now that he did not write his statement of conscience and was not a conscientious objector. But he falls also into the category of what you were describing, Susanna. This person needed join the army because of the economic reasons and college and all that, and the loans and things like that, the education loans and all that. So we were talking about it with our daughter Roxanne, and she's like, well, I don't really think, you know, there will be a draft, and you know, even if there's a war, and most of her peers were in the same thinking.
Yeah, they don't know. You see,
you know, yeah. And I was having trouble even formulating my own opinion on that, because, you know, wars are now conducted with drones and robots. So,
well, that's the issue, isn't it? I mean,
it is also an issue. I mean, you know, when she was talking about draft, I was like, well, I mean, she was interested, and she's like, well, I can still write it. And I was encouraging her to write, because I think regardless if there's a draft or not, it's a good, since they talked about it, it's a good, you know, process to go through to just do personal reflection and put it on paper as to what would you say to someone, even if it's not the authorities, you know, if only, you know, your friends or whatever. But then I was thinking, yeah, would there even be a draft, like the way, you know, I don't know if you all aware about this Ghost Robotics company. Oh, I guess Tim talked about it today at meeting, like those dogs that are basically robot dogs that go and kill, you know, specific targets. And I mean, it's just, and those dogs are actually, they're been engineered or designed. I don't know where they're manufactured, but it's the brainchild of 2 Penn engineering students. And they are used not just in Gaza, they are used in New York City, they're used at the border with Mexico, probably in Puerto Rico, probably in Haiti. I mean, who knows?
Well, it all comes down to whether it's cheaper to kill people or machines. It's really what it is. It all comes down to money. You know, is it? And that's the thing. I mean, that's what I see with what happens in war. What do you do? Whose life is worth it? And anyway, when you have drones, you still need people to run them.
Right, but it's not the same. The people who run them, are they necessarily they're not. I mean, I don't really know how it works.
I don't know how many people are in the military now, but I know this is an issue in Israel at the moment. They don't have enough people, and it's an issue in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, you're right. Yeah.
Even though you have this huge technical war, you still need people, and it's a problem in Russia too. They were pulling people out of prison, murderers out of prison to put in the war because they just couldn't get enough people. And that's really the issue. I mean, it's if you're not, I mean, I'm never going to be drafted. I mean, I'm rather on the old side. But I mean, who knows who's going to be drafted? You know, I mean, what's interesting to me, and this is what I keep coming up again and again, is what happened in Germany in the 1930s was absolutely impossible. It could not have happened. And yet it did. And that's really, you know, it's like, how can we really ruin what's going on? You know, how can we do that? So we don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's very important to look at the different possibilities and make sure that the children are aware that they could be in great danger at some stage. And maybe they won't be, but maybe their children will be. You know, I mean, at the moment, you know, I'm a member of the Natural Academy of Sciences, which is really wonderful. And I learned last week that when I was born in the early 1950s, we had 3 times the rainforest cover that we have now. And at the same time, we had 1/3 the population we have now. I mean, things are really starting to, you know, things are, have we got too many people? Is that what wars are for, to kill people? I mean, I'm wondering if that's the whole purpose of these wars. You know, I don't know. I mean, everything's
well,
just
I mean,
so
you're not far out. It's the purpose. Yeah, I mean, you're not far out. Yes, there's too many people, or there are people places where there are good resources. You know, I mean, it's always the same thing. And the people who are being, you know, killed or genocide are the people that have, quote unquote, no value.
Well, what I remember reading at some stage, that this century was going to be the century about fighting over water. Like last century was fighting over oil, although we still do that. But what we're really doing now is fighting over water, because it's just the amount of drinking water is just not as much as we need in all kinds of places. Yeah, so we don't know. You know, it's interesting. You know, I grew up in Australia, and when I first went to Australia, I lived in Bondi Junction, and my shop was Grace Brothers, and that was the shop that young man took a knife and stabbed a whole lot of people yesterday. So I in Sydney, so I know that area very well, and it's like, what happened? Well, he was living in his car. He had no money. He had mental issues. He was absolutely let down. Meanwhile, Australia has become a country of uber rich people, and I don't know what's going to happen there. Yeah.
Well, I think we've pretty much ended this for the evening. We don't have any new topics.
Yeah,
so
right.
I think I will end the recording.
Yeah. But that was pretty shocking to me, though. I mean, just thinking, how did Australia let go? And then I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. That was one person doing that. maybe there are very good health help for people with mental issues, and maybe that's why it only happened once. So I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is this huge difference between rich and poor, and it's getting wider and wider. And this is causing a whole lot of strife, a whole lot of issues. Yeah.